The document was one page, stamped, dated, filed under a classification that should have buried it permanently. Fort Harlan After Action Report, July 14th, internal use only. Someone had highlighted a single line in yellow, and that line read, Colonel Wade Pruitt sustained a closed radial fracture during live fire training. Incident witnessed by 317 personnel. Classification training accident. Training accident. That is what they called it. 317 soldiers stood on that field, in the Georgia heat, under a sky that had no clouds and no mercy, and not one of them, not a single one, called it an accident. This is the story of what actually happened. And more than that, this is the story of the woman who made it happen, why she did it, and what it cost her to do it. Because before you can understand the moment, you have to understand the person. And before you can understand the person, you have to understand who she came from. Her name was Claire Decker. Captain, United States Army, 32 years old, and she had spent her entire career learning to stay quiet in rooms that wanted her to disappear. She was not tall. She was not loud. She did not wear her record on her sleeve or bring up her deployments in conversation. 2 tours in Kandahar, 1 in Syria, a Purple Heart that she kept in a shoebox under her bunk, not in a frame on the wall. She had been in situations that aged men by a decade in a month, and she had come out of them with the same expression she walked in with. Steady, measured. Like she had already decided long before any crisis arrived exactly how much of herself she was willing to give and exactly how much she was keeping back. The people who served under her noticed things about her before they could name what they were noticing. The way she never raised her voice when raising it would have been easier. The way she stood in formation like she was rooted somewhere deep below the surface, somewhere the wind could not reach. The way she listened, not the way most people listen, waiting for their turn to speak, but like she was actually building something in her mind out of what you gave her. She had her father's eyes, not the color, the quality, the kind of eyes that made you feel when they landed on you that you had just been very clearly seen. Sergeant Major Robert Decker had served 28 years. He had been a man made of discipline and patience and a very specific kind of love, the kind that shows itself not through words, but through time spent, through lessons taught, through the willingness to stand next to someone in the worst weather and say nothing because some things do not need saying. He had been the kind of soldier other soldiers talked about quietly in the back rooms after hours, the way people talk about things that actually mattered. He had been stationed at Fort Harlan from 1991 to 1995. He had walked those grounds, learned every building and road and fence line, understood the culture of the place, the way a man understands a language he has lived in rather than studied. He knew what Fort Harlan was when it was functioning the way it was supposed to function. He also knew what it looked like when it was not. He passed away 3 years before this story begins, quietly the way he had lived, in a hospital in Savannah with his wife, holding one hand and a photograph of his daughter on the nightstand beside him. He was 61 years old, and he left behind a woman who had loved him for 35 years and a daughter who had inherited everything important from him and nothing that was not. The things Claire inherited from her father were not sentimental, they were practical. He had taught her Krav Maga starting when she was 11 years old, not because he wanted to, but because he understood the world she was going to move through, and he refused to let her move through it unprepared. He taught her to shoot long range at 14. He taught her field medicine, navigation, threat assessment, how to read a room by the positions of the people in it. He gave her all of it, every skill, every reflex, and then he gave her something else on top of it. He gave her a promise to make. She was 17 when he sat her down at the kitchen table in their house outside Savannah and told her something she had never forgotten. He said, I have seen what happens when a soldier stops thinking and starts reacting with their body. I have seen what it does to the mission, and I have seen what it does to the person. You have everything I could give you. I am asking you not to use it unless someone is going to die. Not unless you are embarrassed. Not unless you are angry. Not unless it would make you feel better. Only if someone you or someone standing next to you is going to die. She agreed. She was 17 and she meant it. 4 years later, when she enlisted her mother, Sandra Decker, who taught 8th grade English in Savannah and had the quiet toughness of someone who had been married to a soldier for 3 decades, took Claire's hands at the departure gate and said only this, come home. Whatever happens over there, you come home. That was the second promise. 2 promises, one to the living and one to the dead. Both of them mattered. Both of them traveled with her to Kandahar and back to Syria and back, and now 3 years after she buried her father to Fort Harlan. She had been assigned to Fort Harlan on a Tuesday in early June. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in a vehicle that had seen better days with 2 duffel bags and a briefcase, and the kind of posture that did not come from training, but from character. She checked in at the administrative building. She reviewed the base layout. She read the command structure documents she had been given and noticed in the careful way she noticed everything what the structure was designed to obscure. Fort Harlan had been many things over its 40-year history. It had trained rangers. It had supported special forces operations during periods that were still partially classed on. Its culture was the culture of hard men who had done hard things and did not see the need to explain either. That culture, under the right leadership, produced something valuable. Under the wrong leadership, it produced something else entirely. Colonel Wade Pruitt had commanded Fort Harlan for 6 years. He was 54 years old. He was decorated in the way that some men become decorated, not through exceptional performance, but through exceptional positioning. He had a talent for being in the right place at the right time, and for making sure that what was remembered about any given situation reflected well on him. He was connected. He had allies in places that mattered. He had built Fort Harlan into something that functioned on paper as a model installation and off the record as something closer to a private empire. He did not yell. That was the first thing you noticed about him, and then later you realized it was the most dangerous thing about him. Men who yell are broadcasting their limits. Pruitt never broadcast anything. He communicated in calibrated sentences in silences that meant exactly what he intended them to mean, in the slow and deliberate movements of a man who had never once been in a room where he did not believe himself to be in control of it. He called it command presence. Other people, once they were far enough away from him to speak honestly, called it something else. Claire met him at officer orientation on her first full day. She stood in a line of 3 newly assigned officers dressed correctly, posture, correct expression, neutral. Pruitt walked the line slowly. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her rank, then at her face, then back down at the file in his hand, as if confirming something he had already decided. He said quietly enough that only she could hear it clearly, "Another soft promotion." He moved on before she could respond. He did not look back. Claire held his gaze for 1 second, past the point where he had already turned away, held it at the back of his head, and then she returned her eyes to the wall in front of her and said nothing. But something in her had registered it. Not with anger. Anger would have been too simple. With the same quiet operational calm she brought to reading a threat landscape. Something at Fort Harlan was badly wrong. She had just met the source of it. And just like that, without a word exchanged directly, without a single order issued or refused, without any official action taken by either side, the war between them had begun. Fort Harlan soldiers noticed her before she had been there a week. Not because she announced herself, because she did not. In a place where authority was performed loudly and constantly, the absence of performance was its own kind of statement. She showed up to formations before they were called. She stayed in the operations room an hour after everyone else had left, not visibly working, just thinking the way some people need silence and space to actually process what they have taken in. She remembered names, not as a tactic, because she genuinely believed that the name of the person standing in front of you was the minimum you owed them. Briggs Webb was 19 years old and had been at Fort Harlan for 6 weeks when Claire arrived. He was from a small town in eastern Tennessee, had never lived away from home before. He was the kind of young that has not had anything knock it back yet, still open and raw at the edges, struggling in ways he had not told anyone because telling anyone felt like failing. He watched Claire the way young soldiers watch officers they are trying to decide about. He noticed that she never walked past a problem without addressing it, and that she addressed problems without making the person with the problem feel like a problem. He decided privately and without ceremony that she was the only officer on the base he trusted. Major Ellis Carr had been at Fort Harlan for 3 years. He was quiet in the way that some men are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that saying things too soon is the same as wasting them. He had watched 4 officers arrive at Fort Harlan with good records and leave within months diminished in ways that were difficult to document and impossible to miss. He watched Claire arrive, and he observed in the first briefing she attended the moment Pruitt cut her off mid-sentence while she was citing operational data. He watched her receive the interruption without flinching. He watched her sit back down. He opened the small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket and wrote a single word: steady. He did not say this to anyone. He did not act on it immediately. He simply filed it and kept watching. Master Sergeant Reed Kowalski had 17 years in. He had the kind of face that had earned its lines honestly, and the kind of bearing that comes not from pride but from having been tested so many times in so many ways that being tested no longer felt like anything special. He was one of the most respected, non-commissioned officers at Fort Harlan. He had watched 4 officers arrive and leave. He had watched Pruitt outlast all of them. He had developed over those 6 years a very specific kind of awareness, not toward Pruitt, whom he had long since categorized and filed, but toward newcomers. He had learned not to invest in newcomers until they had given him a reason to. On Claire's third day, there was a morning briefing. She arrived at 07:45 for a 07:50 start. Kowalski arrived at 07:30. He noted her arrival time said nothing, and when she took her seat, he observed that she had coffee but had not yet touched it, which meant she had been somewhere before this, somewhere that required her full attention. He did not know where. He filed the data point without assigning it meaning yet. That afternoon, he learned from the base medic that Claire had spent 40 minutes before the briefing tending to a private who had taken a fall during pre-dawn PT. The medic had not yet arrived. Claire had done the initial assessment, dressed the wound, and stayed until proper care was available. She had not mentioned it to anyone. Kowalski filed that too. He said nothing. He simply kept watching. The first weeks of Pruitt's campaign against her were nearly invisible. That was what made them effective. He had done this before, not with her specifically, but with others, and the pattern was consistent enough that it had become for him a kind of procedure. Efficient, deniable, exactly calibrated to produce results that looked from any sufficient distance like routine command decisions. He cut her off in the Tuesday briefing. Not rudely, just at the precise moment when interrupting would undercut what she had said without requiring him to engage with the substance of it. She had been presenting a sitrep on supply inconsistencies near the southern perimeter. 3 specific irregularities, each backed by documentation. She was 2 sentences from the conclusion when his hand came up slow and flat. "We will stick to the standard process," he said. "I am not here for micromanagement from junior officers." The room emptied of sound, the way rooms empty when something has happened that everyone felt but no one is going to name. She was not a junior officer. She was a captain. In the command structure of this installation, she was next in line if anything happened to him. The statement was not ignorance. Ignorance would have been a mistake. This was a message. She nodded once. She sat down. She placed her pen on the notepad in front of her and waited for the briefing to continue. Later, passing a table of lieutenants in the mess hall, she caught the tail end of a whispered exchange. One voice said, "He is already gunning for her." Another said, "Watch yourself, Decker." She did not react. She walked to her table with her tray and ate her meal and filed the information the same way she had been filing everything since she arrived. Building a picture. Not acting on it. Not yet. The memo came 3 days later. She had written it 4 pages operational recommendations, solid analysis backed by field experience. She submitted it through proper channels. 2 days after that, a revised version of those recommendations circulated base-wide under Colonel Pruitt's name. The language had been altered just enough to claim authorship. The core ideas were identical. He had not even changed the structure. She read the circulated memo at her desk in the early evening alone in the operations room. She read it twice. Then she opened her laptop, typed a new document detailed time-stamped with the original draft attached, and saved it to the encrypted drive she kept in the inner pocket of her jacket. She did not confront him. She simply documented it and moved forward. Because in places like Fort Harlan, you do not fight early. You fight right. On a Thursday evening in her second week, she was reviewing supply logs in the motor pool when Kowalski appeared in the doorway. He did not come in. He stood at the threshold the way men stand when they have decided to say something, but have not yet decided how much of it they are going to say. He looked at the logs, then at her. He said, "I have been at this installation for 11 years. I have watched 4 officers come through here with records better than mine will ever be. I want you to know that what he is doing, it is not paperwork. It never was." He left before she could respond. She watched the empty doorway for a long moment. She did not know yet whether that had been an offer or a warning. In places like Fort Harlan, sometimes those were the same thing. It was on a Friday evening, 9 days after her arrival, that she found the files. She had been working late in the administrative wing, cross-referencing supply records that did not add up when examined in aggregate. The operations room was empty. The hallway was quiet. She needed a reference document from the adjacent file room, a room technically accessible to officers of her rank, though rarely visited because it contained records predating the current command structure. The cabinet she needed was the third from the left. The reference document was in the second drawer. She found it quickly. And then because she was who she was and because she noticed things, she noticed that the folder immediately behind the one she had pulled was thicker than it should have been given its label, and that the label was generic enough to have been chosen deliberately. She pulled it. Inside were 3 sets of records. Each one was a formal complaint. Each one had been filed by a female officer. Each one was dated within the last 6 years, exactly the length of Colonel Wade Pruitt's tenure at Fort Harlan. The first was from 2019, the second from 2021, the third from 2022. Each complaint documented a pattern of systematic marginalization, professional sabotage, and command abuse. Each one was detailed. Each one was credible. Each one had been read, stamped, and returned with a notation in the same handwriting, a handwriting she would examine more carefully later when she had time to compare it against official correspondence she had access to. The notation on each file was the same 4 words: resolved, officer reassigned, not Pruitt, the women. She stood in that file room for a long time, long enough for the fluorescent light overhead to flicker once and settle. She read all 3 files, carefully taking in not just the stated facts but the spaces between them. What had been omitted, what had been minimized, what had been translated from specific and documented into vague and deniable. She was the fourth. 3 women before her, 3 complaints buried, 3 careers quietly redirected away from Fort Harlan so the problem would not have to be addressed. She thought about the first woman who had written 4 pages of careful documentation and received 4 words in return. She thought about what it had taken to write that complaint, what it had cost, and what it had felt like to have it disappear. She placed the files back exactly as she had found them. She photographed every page with her phone moving slowly and steadily. Then she removed the USB drive from her jacket pocket, transferred the photographs, and returned the drive to her pocket. She walked back to her quarters through a Fort Harlan that was quiet and dark. She walked without rushing. She breathed steadily. She did not allow herself to feel what she was feeling until she was inside her room with the door closed. Then she sat on the edge of her bunk and let herself feel it. Not rage. Rage would have been easier. What she felt was something colder and more complex, a kind of grief for 3 women she had never met, and a kind of recognition, the way you recognize something you were afraid you were going to find, but had to look for anyway. And underneath that, something that was not a feeling so much as a decision forming. She had a promise to keep. Her father's voice at a kitchen table in Savannah 15 years ago, only if someone is going to die. She was not going to die from this, not from a weapon. But the slow and methodical destruction of a career, a spirit, the will to stay in a fight that mattered, she had read what that looked like in those 3 files. She had read it in the formal, careful language people use when they are trying to be believed. And she understood what it had cost each of those 3 women to write those words and receive 4 words back. She put her phone down. She looked at her hands. Then she picked up the photograph she kept on the small table beside her bunk. Her father in uniform, Fort Harlan visible behind him, 1993. He was 31 years old in the photograph. Younger than she was now. She was not the first person to stand on this ground and understand what it required. She was just the first one in a very long time who was not going to leave. The following week, Pruitt escalated, not dramatically. Dramatically would have been too visible. He escalated in the way he did everything, with precision, with deniability, and with the long-range patience of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much pressure to apply and how to make it look from any direction, like standard command practice. He issued a memo to her unit through channels that bypassed her entirely, going directly to her staff as if she were not in the chain of command at all. The memo was procedural on its surface, routine even, but the bypass was not. In a command structure, bypassing an officer's authority to communicate directly with their subordinates is not a procedural matter. It is a declaration. It says you are not real. Your authority is not real. I can reach past you whenever I choose, and there is nothing you can do about it that will not look like insubordination on your part. Kowalski received the memo. He read it. He set it down on his desk and sat with it for several minutes without moving. He was thinking about the pattern. He had watched Pruitt operate for 6 years. He knew the shape of what this was. He was not yet ready to decide what Captain Decker was going to do about it. But he was getting there. The night before Claire's second week ended, Webb came to her office. He stood at the door until she told him to come in, and then he sat with the particular awkwardness of a young soldier who has something to say and has not yet developed the vocabulary for it. He said, "Ma'am, some of the guys are saying you are going to put in for a transfer." She looked at him. He was not quite meeting her eyes, not from evasion, but the way very young people sometimes cannot look directly at things that matter to them. She said, "Who told them that?" He said, "Nobody told them. They just think it, because of the way things have been going." She thought about the 3 women in the files. She thought about what it would mean to be the 4th set of 4 words. She said, "Briggs." He looked up. She almost never used first names. She said, "I am not going anywhere." He nodded, not with relief, though the relief was there, with something more serious, the expression of someone who has been given a piece of information they intend to carry carefully. He stood up, returned to attention, and left. She watched the door close and turned back to the work on her desk. The unannounced drill came on a Monday. No warning, no notice in the weekly operations schedule. At 05:30, while the Georgia sky was still the color of old iron runners, were sent to the barracks with verbal orders, full kit assembly, field 15 minutes. No explanation, no context, just the order and the 15 minutes and the particular tension that follows an order that everyone immediately understands is not about training. Claire was already awake. She had been awake since 04:30, sitting at her desk with the supply logs she had not finished reviewing, working in the low light of the single lamp, because she had never been able to sleep past the hour when her father used to begin his day. She heard the runners in the corridor. She heard boots hitting floors in sequence down the length of the barracks. She closed the supply log, stood up, and began putting on her kit with the methodical economy of someone who had done it in worse conditions and with less time. She knew without being told that this was directed at her unit specifically. She assembled with her unit on the field at 05:45. The sky had lightened just enough to see faces. 31 soldiers ranging from 19 to 36 standing in the controlled stillness of people who know they are being set up for something and are choosing not to say so. She walked the line once without speaking, looking at each of them, not checking them, seeing them. There is a difference, and the people being looked at always know which one it is. Webb was at the far end, 19 years old, kit slightly off center straps, not quite right. He saw her coming and made a small adjustment. She stopped beside him and without comment corrected the left shoulder strap by 2 inches. The adjustment changed his center of gravity in a way he could feel immediately. He said nothing. She moved on. Pruitt arrived at 0600. He came with 2 junior officers and a corporal carrying a tablet. He did not acknowledge Claire directly. He gave the parameters of the assessment to the junior officer beside him, who read them aloud. Distance 12 kilometers. Terrain mixed, including the eastern ridge where the elevation gained 400 feet in less than 2 kilometers. Time limit none specified, which was its own kind of pressure. Packs at combat weight. Weapons carried, not slung. Claire listened to the parameters without reacting. Then she looked at her unit and said, "Form up on me." She ran with them. That was the first thing Kowalski noticed from his position near the equipment building, where he had no official reason to be, but where he was anyway, because 17 years had given him enough pattern recognition to know when something was worth watching. She did not stand at the start point and send them off. She did not manage from behind. She ran at the front for the first kilometer, then dropped back to the middle, then moved to the rear where the pace was thinning as the eastern ridge started taking what it was going to take. The eastern ridge was the kind of terrain that makes a person honest. There is nowhere to hide on a slope when your legs are full of lactic acid and your pack is at combat weight, and the person beside you can hear exactly how much you are struggling. It separates the soldiers who are fit from the soldiers who are committed from the soldiers who are both. Webb hit the wall at kilometer 9. Not a collapse. The specific kind of wall that arrives not when the body is broken, but when the conversation between the body and the mind breaks down, when the body sends signals the mind has not learned yet to override. His stride shortened. His head dropped. He was 3 kilometers from the finish and losing the argument with himself. Claire appeared beside him. She matched his reduced stride exactly. She did not touch him. She did not tell him he could do it, because telling someone they can do something they are currently not doing has never once helped anyone do it. She said only 3 counts, breathe out. Just the breathing. Do not think past the breathing. He looked at her. She was looking forward, not at him. Forward at the 11-degree slope at the ground in front of them. Running, breathing exactly the way she had told him to breathe. He matched it. 3 counts in, out. The stride lengthened. Not all the way back, but enough. He kept going. They finished ahead of the time Pruitt's junior officer had privately set as the failure threshold. The full unit, every one of them. Claire came in behind Webb, which meant she had stayed at the back of the formation all the way to the line, running slower than she was capable of, so that the person who needed steadiness most would have it beside him. Pruitt was not at the finish point. He had gone inside at kilometer 8. Kowalski was still at the equipment building. He watched the unit return. He watched Webb cross the finish with his head up. He watched Claire come in last and move immediately through her unit with water and brief exchanges and the kind of attention that does not announce itself. He added something to the entry in his notebook that already held the word steady. He wrote deliberate. Then he closed the notebook and went back to work. Sloan Doyle had been at Fort Harlan for 8 months. She was 26, a first lieutenant, arrived with a solid record in a quiet manner that had not yet attracted the kind of attention that could work either for or against her. Claire had been assigned to mentor her as part of a base-wide junior officer development program that predated Pruitt's tenure, one he had never bothered to cancel because it provided no obvious angle for him to exploit. Claire had been working with Doyle twice a week for 2 weeks, 45 minutes each session, going over operational planning decision frameworks, the mechanics of effective command communication. Doyle was sharp. She asked good questions and processed answers carefully. She did not perform competence, she worked toward it, which meant the gaps she revealed were real gaps she was trying to close. Claire had begun to trust her. Not fully, not yet, but she had begun. On a Wednesday evening, in her 4th week crossing the administrative building to return a reference document, she heard something that stopped her in the hallway before she reached the corner. Doyle's voice. Low, precise reading from something. Then a pause. Then a response that did not come from casual conversation, clipped, satisfied, the acknowledgement of someone who has received what they were waiting for. Claire stood on her side of the corner for a moment. Then she turned and walked in a different direction. She spent the rest of that evening in the motor pool reviewing logs she did not need to review, giving herself space and silence to process what she had heard without reacting to it before she understood it. She gave it 2 more days. On Friday, she told Doyle casually at the end of their session that she was thinking about reviewing the Northern Perimeter Assessment protocols over the weekend. Some inconsistencies she wanted to look at Saturday morning. There were no inconsistencies. There was no Saturday review. She had said it specifically and only to see what happened to it. By Saturday afternoon, a memo had been routed through an administrative channel, not to Claire but to a logistics officer she coordinated with, asking about Northern Perimeter Protocol documentation in a way that made clear someone was establishing a record of her activities. The memo originated from Colonel Pruitt's office. She sat with that information for 1 more day. Then on Sunday morning, she asked Doyle to come to her office. Doyle came. She sat across from Claire with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen and is now watching it happen and does not know whether to feel relieved or terrified. Claire looked at her for a long moment, not confrontationally, the way she looked at things she needed to understand completely before responding. She said, "I know." Doyle looked at her hands. Claire said, "I am not angry. I want you to understand that before we talk. I am not angry because what he did to get you here is not something I hold against you. I want you to tell me what he threatened." "It was a threat," Doyle said. Her voice held the evenness of someone who has been keeping something controlled for a long time and is allowing the control to ease because the effort of maintaining it has become more expensive than the cost of releasing it. She told Claire about an incident from 8 months ago, a navigation error during a field exercise that had resulted in minor property damage. The kind of mistake that would not have ended a career, but that documented and submitted through certain channels with certain framings could be made to look like something significantly worse. Pruitt had the documentation. He had told her very quietly and very clearly what he would do with it if she did not cooperate. Claire listened without interrupting. When Doyle finished, the silence lasted long enough to be felt. Claire said, "He uses what you are afraid of. The way it works is it gets heavier the longer you carry it. The only way it stops working is if you stop being afraid of it." Doyle looked up. "What he has on you," Claire said, "is a training error. What you have on him right now in this room is a direct order from a commanding officer to surveil and report on a fellow officer. Those are not equivalent things." She slid a small digital recorder across the desk. She said, "Nothing you do with this has to happen today. But anything he says to you directly, any order he gives it, has value. Not to me specifically, to a record that is being built." Doyle looked at the recorder. She looked at it for several seconds in the way people look at decisions before they make them. Then she picked it up and left with it in her pocket. Claire sat alone in the room after she was gone and allowed herself a brief private acknowledgement of what had just shifted, not a victory. Too small for that word, but a change in the weight distribution of something that had been increasingly one-sided. The paper cuts continued that week and the week after. A supply request went missing in routing for 11 days. A training drill was canceled without notice by a memo she was not copied on. A promotion recommendation she had submitted for a specialist, documented, merited, properly formatted, was returned with a single handwritten note, "Premature." No further explanation. The specialist received the notation without knowing that the original recommendation had been written at all. Claire documented each one. She added to her encrypted drive with the same methodical patience she brought to everything, building a record that was not yet a weapon, but was being treated with the same care she would give one. There was a night in her third week when she sat on the edge of her bunk with the 3 files on her laptop screen and allowed herself, for the first time since finding them, to think about what they meant in terms of what was coming. The first woman had lasted 4 months. The second had lasted 7. The third had lasted 5. Claire had been at Fort Harlan for 3 weeks. By the logic of what had happened before, she had between 1 and 4 more months remaining before the pressure built to where staying became impossible. Except that the 3 women before her had not known about each other. She knew about all 3 of them. And knowing changed everything. What was happening to her was not ambiguous, not open to interpretation, that she was misreading the situation, perhaps oversensitive to things with innocent explanations. There were no innocent explanations in the pattern of 3 files each stamped with the same 4 words over a 6-year period. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark. She was not going to leave. That was the only decision she had made clearly and completely since arriving. But she needed to understand what not leaving was going to cost her, because her father had taught her that you do not enter a fight without knowing your accounting. First, what you are willing to spend, what you are not, and what price you might be asked to pay that you had not planned for. On the desk in front of her, open to the last page she had been reviewing, was the supply log. At the bottom of that page, in her own handwriting, from the first days after finding the 3 files, was a note she had made to herself. 4 words. Not Pruitt's 4 words. Her own. Account for what's coming. She had done that. She had done it methodically and without announcement in the hours before 0430, when the base was still dark, and in the evenings when everyone else had gone, and in the nights when the 3 files were open on her screen, and the women behind them were as present in that room as anyone she had served with. She picked up her father's photograph from the nightstand. 1993, Fort Harlan behind him. He had found gaps. He had closed them in ways that cost him things. He had not talked about those costs much, but she was his daughter and she knew how to read what was not said. She put the photograph down and got 3 hours of sleep and was awake before 0430. It was Kowalski who came to her office 11 days before the live fire drill. He came at 2100, late enough that the administrative wing was empty. He knocked twice, waited, and when she said, "Come in," he entered and stood just inside the door with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not exactly concern. The expression of a man who has been watching something develop with a certain detachment and has reached the point where detachment is no longer honest. He said, "I need to talk to you about the drill." She waited. He said he had a source. He did not identify the source. In 17 years, he had operated on the principle that sources are protected without exception, and he had never varied from it. The source had told him about a live fire maneuver scheduled in 10 days, announced to her unit as a standard readiness assessment. The source had told him something else about it. Pruitt had contacted a JAG officer, informally through channels that created no paper trail 3 weeks prior. He had discussed the procedural requirements for filing an insubordination charge against a captain under his command. He had established exactly what behaviors would need to be witnessed and documented. He had arranged drone footage from a specific angle covering the assembly field. He had prepared, though not yet filed, a preliminary document that could be completed and submitted within 24 hours of an incident. He was not running a drill. He was constructing a courtroom. Claire sat with this in the silence of her office. Outside, Fort Harlan settled into its late evening routines. Distant voices from the barracks, the hum of equipment in the motor pool. She was aware of all of it with the precision of a person whose senses are operating at a higher level than normal. Kowalski said, "I am going to say something, and I want you to hear it as coming from someone who has watched this installation for 6 years. Request a transfer. Tonight. Put it in writing before 0600 tomorrow. Cite personal reasons. You do not owe anyone an explanation that exposes you to what he is building." She looked at him. She said nothing for a moment. She said, "My father was stationed here." Kowalski's expression shifted. A small change around the eyes. The particular change that happens when a piece of information retroactively reorganizes something a person has been carrying without knowing what it was. She said, "He walked this ground for 4 years. He told me what this place was supposed to be, what the people here were supposed to be responsible for." Kowalski said nothing. She said, "I am not leaving because Pruitt built a trap. If I leave because he built a trap, the trap works. And then the person who comes after me does not know the trap exists, and she walks into it." The room held that. Kowalski looked at her for a long time. He was not evaluating her. He had stopped evaluating her somewhere around the eastern ridge. He was doing something else, seeing maybe for the first time with complete clarity what he had been building toward with 17 years of watching people under pressure. He said, "All right." He said it quietly, without ceremony. He said, "Then we need to talk about what you are going to do when you get to the field." They talked for 40 minutes. He told her everything the source had revealed, the camera angles, the procedural sequence Pruitt intended to trigger, the exact language of the insubordination charge waiting in a desk drawer. She listened without writing anything down. She absorbed information the way her father had absorbed it completely and without waste. When he finished, she said, "He designed the drill so any initiative I take can be called insubordination." Kowalski said, "Yes." She said, "He needs me to react. He needs me to do something he can document as unauthorized action." Kowalski said, "That is what the JAG consultation was about. He has the language." She said, "Then the question is not whether I take initiative. I will take initiative. The question is what kind and when." She told him about the protocol, the specific section, the precise language, the conditions under which a ranking officer in a live fire situation was not only authorized but required to call a reposition without waiting for command confirmation, written in 1987, by people who understood that command situations in live fire carry a margin for authorized initiative that cannot be removed without creating a safety liability. Kowalski said, "He is going to try to override you on the field." She said, "I know," he said, "in front of 300 people." She said, "I know that too," he said, "and you are going to let it happen." She looked past him at the wall, at nothing specific, then back at him. She said, "I have spent 6 years in uniform holding my ground in places where the ground was actively trying to kill me. I know how to stand still when something is moving toward me." Kowalski stood. He moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back once, and there was something in his expression she would remember later when she had time to think about what that night had actually contained. He said, "Your father, Robert Decker." She said, "Yes." He said, "He had good instincts." He left before she could ask him how he knew. She sat alone for a long time after he was gone. The base was quiet, nearly midnight, the Georgia summer pressing against the windows with a damp heat that never fully released even at this hour. She sat with the knowledge of what was coming. The drone camera, the JAG document in the desk drawer, 317 soldiers who would be on that field. She looked at her hands, the hands her father had trained, the hands that had been kept for 15 years and through 2 tours in Kandahar and 1 in Syria for the use her father had prescribed. She breathed out. She counted 4 and held 7, 8 out. Her father's method. The one he had taught her for moments that required absolute stillness before movement became necessary. Then she placed her hands flat on the desk, fingers spread, pressed into the surface. She held them there. She was not going to be the 4th person to leave in silence. The morning of the drill came in without announcement. July in Georgia does not ease into itself. It arrives fully formed, the heat already present at 0600, in a way that makes the air feel inhabited before the day has properly begun. The assembly field at Fort Harlan caught the early light on its packed dirt surface and returned it flat and without mercy. And the 317 soldiers who assembled there stood in it the way soldiers stand in conditions they cannot control, with the practiced stillness of people who have learned that the weather does not adjust to accommodate you. Claire arrived at 5:58. She walked onto the field from the eastern entrance, kit-correct rifle-slung helmet clipped, and took her position at the head of the formation with the same expression she had brought to every morning at Fort Harlan since the first one. Steady, present, not performing readiness, actually ready. She had slept 4 hours. She had been awake since 0400. She had read the protocol section one final time, not because she needed to, she had it exact and complete, but because there is a kind of discipline in returning to the thing you are going to stake everything on and making sure one more time that you have it right. She knew where the drone camera was positioned. She knew the field of view it covered. She knew the blind spot in the eastern quadrant and the fact that the left flank of her formation, the area she had identified as carrying a positional vulnerability in this terrain configuration, was in the drone's primary frame. She knew all of this, and she had decided what to do with it, which was nothing she would not have done if she had not known it. That was important. Not tactically, morally. If she adjusted her conduct based on the camera position, she was performing correctness rather than practicing it, and the difference between those two things mattered to her in a way that was not about appearance. Her father had told her once when she was 14 and asked why he held himself to standards even when no one was watching, because the only version of yourself that is actually real is the one that shows up when no one is looking. Everything else is costume. She was not going to wear a costume on this field. The drill parameters were delivered by Pruitt's junior officer at 0610. Standard live fire maneuver, 3 phases repositioning between phases based on command direction. The formation would take its initial position on the western line and advance on signal. Command adjustments to be issued from the observation post on the northern side of the field. All initiative to be cleared through command before execution. That last instruction was not standard. Claire noted it. She did not react. The drill began. The first phase proceeded without incident. Her unit moved with the coherence of soldiers who have trained together and trust the person directing them a different quality of movement than soldiers simply following orders. There is something in it that experienced observers identify immediately: a half step of confidence, a willingness to commit to a direction before the full rationale has been explained, because the track record of the person giving direction has been earned. Kowalski was at the observation post in an official capacity as senior NCO with oversight responsibilities for live fire safety protocol. He stood beside Major Ellis Carr, who had appeared at the post at 0602 without explanation or invitation, and who had said nothing since his arrival. Only stood and watched the field with the expression he brought to everything: quiet, thorough, complete. The second phase was where the terrain showed its problem. The formation had advanced 230 meters from the initial line. The repositioning point for Phase 2 placed the left flank against the low point of a natural gradient change barely noticeable in planning documents, significant in practice when soldiers in full kit at combat weight were moving across it under time pressure. The left flank was being positioned with high ground to its left and no coverage to its right. It was not a safety emergency. It was a positional vulnerability. Exactly the kind that a ranking field officer was not only authorized but required to correct. She called the reposition. Clear voice, standard field language. The call directed to her unit's left flank element with the correction angle and reasoning stated plainly for the benefit of anyone within earshot. The left flank moved 11 seconds. The formation adjusted. The vulnerability closed. From the northern observation post, Pruitt's voice came across the field like a change in weather pressure. Not loud. He never needed to be loud, but carrying the way voices carry when they have been calibrated for exactly this. Captain Decker, who gave you the authority to override my formation? She turned toward the observation post. She stated the protocol number, the section, and the specific condition under which it applied. She stated it the way you state something that exists in writing in a document predating the current command and that has never been amended. The field absorbed what she had said and held it. Nobody filled it. The comm was quiet for 4 seconds. Then Pruitt came off of the observation post. He crossed the field with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided something and is not reconsidering it. The junior officers watched him go. Carr watched from beside Kowalski without moving. Kowalski's hands were at his sides. Pruitt reached the formation line and kept walking. He did not stop at the appropriate command distance. He came to within arm's reach of Claire and stopped there in the space that is not a command space but a personal space, the space that carries a specific meaning when one person enters it uninvited and the other does not move. 317 soldiers were on that field. They were watching in the way soldiers watch things they will remember, not with the detachment of spectators, but with the full body attention of people who understand that what they are seeing is going to mean something. Claire did not step back. She had understood this moment in the nights before it. She understood that whatever happened here was not happening in a vacuum. 317 people were recording it in the most permanent way available, which is memory. Pruitt's voice was low enough that it was not carrying to the full formation. He said, "You think you can embarrass me in front of my men?" She said, "They are not your men, sir. They are soldiers under my command, and I followed field protocol. The protocol you issued in writing last month." His lip moved in a way that was not a smile. He said, "I will teach you something else right now." What she saw in the next half second was not Pruitt. It was the 3 files. The first woman who had written 4 careful pages and received 4 words. The second whose documentation had been the most detailed. The third who had filed anyway and been reassigned anyway. She saw the pattern of 6 years. She saw the 4th line in the document where her name would go if she stood here and absorbed what was coming and did not respond to it. And she heard her father's voice from a kitchen table in Savannah. 15 years ago, and somehow also right here on this field in the Georgia heat, only if someone is going to die. She understood in the clarity of that half second what dying could mean. Not always a body, sometimes a person, Sometimes the thing in a person that makes them capable of standing on a field and calling a correct formation adjustment in front of a commanding officer who wants to use it against them. Sometimes the thing the fourth woman would need when she arrived at Fort Harlan and stood in the same place and was handed the same four words. If that thing died here, that was the death her father had been talking about. She was certain of it. His shoulder moved first, the weight transfer that precedes a strike intent becoming motion. Her training did not ask permission. It was older than her current thoughts and more specific than her current fear, and it moved with the directness of a reflex built over 20 years into something that does not require the conscious mind to authorize it. Left hand, wrist, the angle that uses momentum rather than opposing it. The pivot that requires nothing but geometry and the willingness to step through. The sound was a single hard crack. It crossed the assembly field with the flat precision of a round going down range, and every soldier on that field felt it in a different part of their body, some in the chest, some in the spine, some in the hands from memory. Pruitt went to one knee. His right arm was wrong in a way that arms should not be. His face held the expression of a man who has encountered something that completely contradicts his prior model of how the world operates. He was not in control of the sound. He made a short, involuntary exhalation, and he was not in control of the color leaving his face, which went from its usual authority to something much closer to ordinary. Claire released his wrist immediately. She stepped back exactly one step and stood in the position she had been in before he crossed the field. Her breathing was unchanged. Her expression was what it always was. She said, "You will not raise your hand to me again, Colonel." Her voice was at its normal level. It carried to the full formation. 317 people stopped breathing at the same time. That was what it felt like. The field went so still that the sound of the medic's boots crossing the dirt was the loudest thing in it. And then something happened that Claire would think about more than she would think about the strike or the wrist or the sound of the crack. Webb stepped out of the formation. One step forward out of the line. He said nothing. He stood. Sloan Doyle came in from the edge of the field and walked forward until she was standing. She said nothing. Major Ellis Carr came down from the observation post. He walked across the field with the unhurried pace of a man who has decided where he is going. He stopped 12 feet from Claire and turned to face the same direction she was facing. He did not speak. And then Kowalski came off the post. 17 years. He walked with the weight of them steady and without hurry, and he positioned himself with the small group that had formed without any of them planning it, and he stood. Behind those four others shifted, not all of them, not dramatically, but enough. A repositioning of bodies that said something that had not been said on this field in 6 years of Wade Pruitt's command of it. Claire looked at them. She did not speak. She looked at each of them once directly and then returned her gaze to the middle distance. She became aware of her hands. She held them at her sides, and she was aware of them in a way she had never been before, not even in the worst moments of the deployments, not even in the field medicine situations where they had been the only thing standing between an outcome and its alternative. They had done something that could not be undone, not legally, not morally. She understood the necessity with complete clarity and would understand it the same way in 20 years. But in the way her father had understood these things, the promise was not intact anymore. The thing she had carried from a kitchen table in Savannah for 15 years had been placed down on a drill field in Georgia, and she could not pick it back up in the form it had been in. She would have to carry what came after it instead. Colonel Conrad Roth arrived from Washington 48 hours later. He was the kind of man that institutions produce when they need to believe themselves capable of objectivity. Square-shouldered, clipped in his speech with the manner of someone who has spent a career navigating the space between what actually happened and what can be officially established to have happened, and who carries no illusions about the distance between those two things. He set up in the conference room of the administrative building with a laptop, a legal pad, and a stack of printed documents, and he reviewed the footage before speaking to anyone. There were 3 camera angles: the drone from the North Tower, helmet footage from a junior officer running his camera as part of a separate training documentation protocol, the surveillance feed from the Eastern Perimeter Tower recording passively as part of base security. All 3 captured the same sequence: the approach, the distance violation, the shoulder movement, the wrist, the sound, the release. He watched all 3 twice before he asked Claire to come in. She sat across from him and did not fill the silence. She had learned a long time ago that filling silence in rooms like this one was a way of telling the other person what you were afraid they were going to ask. Roth said, "Colonel Pruitt has a closed radial fracture. You caused it." She said, "He attempted to strike me. I intercepted the strike with minimum force." "Yes, Ross said he is filing a formal complaint, assault on a superior officer. She said the footage shows what happened in the correct sequence. I am available to be questioned about any part of it. Roth looked at her. He said, why did you not de-escalate? She said, I did. I caught his wrist before it landed. That was my de-escalation. The alternative was absorbing a strike from a superior officer in front of 300 soldiers, which would have established for everyone on that field that an officer in my position has no protected standing. I was not willing to establish that. Roth was quiet. He had not written anything on his legal pad since she sat down. He said, I have received statements. He moved a hand toward the stack on his right. It was substantial. He said, in the 31 hours since the incident, I have received 43 unsolicited written statements from personnel at Fort Harlan. I did not request them. They were submitted through formal channels, some signed, some anonymous, varying in length. They are not identical in content, but they are consistent in their account of Colonel Pruitt's conduct at this installation over the past 6 years. He paused. He said, I have also received something else. He placed a USB drive on the table between them. It was not her USB drive. He said, Lieutenant Doyle submitted this yesterday morning. It contains audio recordings made over approximately 10 days. The recordings document specific directives given to Lieutenant Doyle by Colonel Pruitt regarding the surveillance of your activities and the channeling of information about your schedule to his office. The directives are explicit. The identity of the person giving them is not ambiguous. He let that sit. He said there is also a separate encrypted drive submitted to my office. I am told it contains photographic records of 3 previous complaint filings related to Colonel Pruitt's command, and that those complaints were closed without disciplinary action at a level above the installation command. He looked at her. She said, I found those files in the 4th week of my assignment here. I documented them and retained the documentation. He said, why not submit them through official channels at the time? She said, because the official channel those 3 complaints were closed through is the same channel I would have been submitting to. I needed a more complete record before I submitted anything. Roth put down his pen. He leaned back. He said, I am going to be honest with you, Captain. What I have on this table is one of the more complete operational records of institutional misconduct I have seen come to me in this form. In terms of documentation timeline and corroborated witness account, you have built something that most formal investigations would take months to assemble. She said I had 6 weeks. He said, I understand that. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table. A temporary suspension pending formal review. No cuffs, no reprimand language. A formality of process, not a judgment. He said, this is going to formal hearing. You should have counsel. She said, I understand. She was at the door when he said her name and she turned. He said the 43 statements. 11 of them are from NCOs with more than 10 years at this installation. They submitted within 31 hours of the incident. He met her eyes. He said, that is not something that happens because of one afternoon on a field. That is something that happens because of 6 weeks. She left him in the conference room and walked out into Fort Harlan. Pruitt was escorted from the base hospital 4 days later. No press, no formal statement. His attorney released language calling the incident a targeted professional attack and attributing it to institutional bias. The response came from veteran networks forums and group messages in the quiet channels of people who understand the difference between what official statements say and what actually happened. Rank tabs appeared in photographs with 6 words beneath them: protect those who protect each other. Webb came to her office 2 days after Pruitt's departure and told her about the rank tabs with the expression of someone delivering news that is both significant and slightly beyond his ability to fully process. She thanked him. She told him to get some sleep. General Victor Stanton arrived from Regional Command on the 5th day. He was the kind of general who reaches that rank through a combination of genuine competence and specific political intelligence, the ability to identify where power is flowing and position himself in its current rather than against it. He had been in the Army for 31 years. He had backed Pruitt's command through 2 reviews, 1 informal complaint cycle, and a personnel restructuring that had brought Pruitt's position under brief scrutiny 3 years ago. He had backed him because Pruitt produced results on the metrics that Stanton's superiors measured, and because the things Pruitt did that did not appear on those metrics had been until now sufficiently contained. They were no longer contained. Stanton met with Roth and General Hale in a closed session that lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The outcomes: Roth's formal review would proceed. Pruitt would not return to Fort Harlan. The 43 statements would be entered into the official record. Captain Claire Decker would be reassigned to Westfield Command effective in 10 days. The announcement would characterize the reassignment as a promotion. Claire was called to Stanton's temporary office that evening. He did not offer a seat. He stood behind the desk in the way people stand when they want the furniture between themselves and the person they are addressing to function as more than furniture. He said, "Captain, you have made quite a name for yourself." She said, "I did not ask to." He said, "No. But now journalists are calling. A senator has submitted an inquiry to the Oversight Committee. Veterans organizations are citing this installation by name. And you have become the face of something considerably larger than a drill field incident." He moved to the window. He said, "Captains do not lead movements. They execute orders and advance through the structure in the sequence the structure permits. What you have done here has disrupted a sequence that was functioning." She said, "It was functioning for one person, sir." He turned from the window. The sentence landed with the weight she had intended. He said, "You are being reassigned to Westfield Command. Publicly, it is a promotion. Privately, it removes you from the center of a situation that requires controlled resolution." She looked at him steadily. She said, "You are not silencing me by sending me somewhere. You are sending me somewhere with everything I know and everything I have documented. That is not a firebreak, General. That is a relay." Stanton looked at her for a long moment with an expression that contained both anger and something that was not quite its opposite, but moved in that direction. He said nothing further. He nodded once, the economy of a man conceding a point he cannot publicly concede, and walked out with the sound of boots on a floor that no longer deferred to them the way it once had. It was Carr who found her the next morning. He appeared beside her on the walkway outside the administrative building in the way he always materialized, without announcement, without preamble. He walked with her in silence for 20 meters. Then he held out a folded piece of paper. She took it. He said, "NCO Network. Nothing written goes through official channels in a situation like this, but it moves. 31 years of it moves very specifically and very accurately." She unfolded the paper. A short list, handwritten. 3 sets of details, dates, personnel descriptions, patterns of conduct, each one from Westfield Command. She looked at the list, then at him. He said 3 of the 30 statements that Roth received came from people transferred out of Westfield in the last 14 months. The details they described are familiar. She said, "Stanton knows the situation at Westfield." Carr said he has known it for some time. A silence opened between them. Then Carr said something else. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, flat, factual, without editorial. He said the notation on those 3 files. The 4 words. "Resolved, officer reassigned. That handwriting belongs to Stanton. I confirmed it against the official correspondence archive 4 days ago. He has been at the regional command level for 8 years. He was Pruitt's commanding officer when Pruitt was assigned here. He approved the assignment, and he protected it through 2 review cycles because Pruitt's metrics served him." She said he knew what Pruitt was doing to those women. Carr said he knew before the first file was ever submitted. The first woman went to him directly before she put anything in writing. He told her the complaint process would take months and suggested a lateral transfer as a faster resolution. She trusted him. She transferred. Everything that needed to be said about that lived in the silence that followed. Carr said, "What you put in front of Roth, the encrypted drive, the 3 files, the complete timeline, that evidence does not just document Pruitt, it documents the person who kept Pruitt in place. Stanton sending you to Westfield is not about controlling the situation at Fort Harlan anymore. He is trying to limit what that evidence means for him personally." He turned and looked at her once more. He said, "Make sure Roth knows that before you leave." She said, "He already does." Carr nodded. Something in the nod suggested this was the answer he had expected, and the expectation had satisfied him. He turned and walked back toward the administrative building without another word. She looked at the list in her hand. 3 names, 3 patterns. Westfield. Stanton was not sending her there to silence her. He had run out of people willing to go. Kowalski was at the main gate on the morning of her departure. Webb was there too, standing 20 feet to the right of the gate with his hands at his sides and the expression of a 19-year-old who has decided he is going to be somewhere and is not explaining himself to anyone. She had not told him what time she was leaving. She had not told anyone except the driver. She did not ask how he knew. When she reached Kowalski, he held out a plain envelope. She took it. He said, "I received that 4 years ago, before you were assigned here. Your father sent letters to people he had served with, people he trusted. He told me you might come through here one day. He asked me to look out for you." She did not open the envelope. She looked at it. He said, "I want you to understand something. The reason I did not trust you when you arrived, it was not what you thought it was. I have watched this installation for 17 years, and I have watched Pruitt for 6 of them, and I have watched 4 officers arrive with good records and leave without them. I did not trust newcomers because trusting newcomers at Fort Harlan had stopped being rational. He paused. He said, but that was not the only reason. Your father asked me to make sure you were worth what he believed you were. Before I put myself behind anyone at this installation again, I needed to see it. He looked at her directly. He said, I saw it on the Eastern Ridge. I saw it in your office with Doyle. I saw it on the field when you called the reposition and stood there and waited for what was coming. He said he was right about you. He usually was. She held the envelope carefully. The way you hold something irreplaceable when you first understand that it is irreplaceable. She said, how long had he been sick when he wrote this? Kowalski said, the date is on it. She looked at the postmark, a year before her father died. A year before the hospital in Savannah. Before the photograph on the nightstand, before the quiet ending of a life that had given her everything she had used on this field. He had written it knowing he had a year left. He had spent some of that year writing letters to the people he trusted most, at the places that had mattered most, asking them in his particular way to stand in the spaces where he would not be able to stand. She could not speak for a moment. Kowalski did not fill the silence. He had 17 years of understanding what silence was for. She said, thank you, Sergeant. He nodded once. Then Westfield. I know people there. NCOs. The network car mentioned it runs through there. You will not be going in without information. She said, I know. He almost smiled. Close enough, he said. He said you would say that too. She got in the vehicle. The driver pulled forward through the gate, and Fort Harlan began to recede in the side mirror, the administrative buildings, the barracks, the assembly field empty in the morning light. She did not look back through the rear window. She watched it in the mirror. You see things in mirrors in reverse, and sometimes the reversal is clarifying. She opened the envelope, her father's handwriting. She had grown up with it, the particular slant, the precision of the letter forms, the way he pressed slightly harder on consonants than vowels, which was not something she had consciously noticed until she was reading letters from a man who was no longer alive to write new ones. The letter was 3 paragraphs, not long. He had never used more words than the situation required. The first paragraph was about Fort Harlan. He wrote about what the place had been when he served there, what it was capable of being, and what it sometimes became when the wrong person held command and the right people stayed quiet, because staying quiet felt like survival. He wrote about the gap between what an institution was supposed to be and what the people inside it were responsible for doing when they found that gap. The second paragraph was about her. It was the shortest. He wrote that he had given her everything he could give her and that he trusted her with it. That the promise he had asked her to make was not about limitation. It was about purpose, about making sure that what she could do was always in service of something that warranted it. He wrote that he believed without reservation that she would know when that thing arrived. The third paragraph was one sentence. He had written, when you find the place where my work is not finished, finish it. She refolded the letter along its original lines and placed it carefully in the inner pocket of her jacket against her chest where the USB drive had been. She looked out the window at the Georgia morning, the flat highway, the pines on either side running parallel to the road in the way that trees run parallel to things when you are moving through them too fast to see the individual ones. Only the line of them, the continuous unbroken line. Westfield was 4 hours from Fort Harlan. She had the NCO network through car. She had the list of 3 names. She had Kowalski's contacts. She had 43 statements in a formal record now bearing her name or as a related party in a review that was not going to close quietly. She had an encrypted drive with documentation built over 6 weeks of methodical attention to the difference between what was happening and what was being claimed about it. She had the handwriting confirmed as Stanton's on 3 files, and Roth had that information, and what Roth did with it was now part of a process that had moved beyond any single person's ability to contain. She had her father's letter in her jacket pocket, and somewhere beneath the cost of the last 6 weeks and the weight of the promise she had placed down on a drill field in Georgia, she had the understanding of why she was the person in this vehicle on this road going to this place. Not only because she had been sent, but that was not the reason. She was going because the third woman in the third file had written 4 careful pages and received 4 words, and the second had done the same, and the first had gone to Stanton directly before putting anything in writing and had trusted him and transferred, and each of them had been redirected to somewhere that was not the problem, and the problem had continued, and somewhere in the 6 years of that continuation a pattern had established itself that would have gone on establishing itself indefinitely, if the fourth person had been the same as the first 3. She was not the same as the first three, not because she was better, because she had arrived knowing what they had not known until it was already done to them. She had arrived with the files, and she had stayed with that knowledge rather than running from it, and she had built something in 6 weeks that had taken Pruitt 6 years to build in the opposite direction. Under the rearview mirror, Webb had taped something before she boarded. She had not seen him do it. She noticed it now in the angled light of the Georgia morning. The same drawing that had appeared on her door, the rough pencil sketch of a soldier standing upright, the shadow looming behind with its hand raised. But this copy was different. Someone had added to it. Behind the single standing figure there were others, not a crowd, just enough, standing in the same posture, facing the same direction. Below the drawing, the same 5 words. Strength isn't loud, it just doesn't move. And below that, in different handwriting, smaller added after the original words had already been written. Yet, she did not look away from it for a long time. The highway continued. Fort Harlan was behind her, and Westfield was ahead, and the Georgia morning was doing what Georgia mornings do, which is burn away whatever was left of the night with a thoroughness that does not negotiate with what came before it. She put her hand against the inner pocket of her jacket. She could feel the weight of the envelope through the fabric. Her father had walked onto difficult ground for 28 years and had done it without announcing himself and without asking the ground to be different than it was. He had closed gaps where he found them and paid what it cost and passed what he knew to the only person he trusted with it. She was 4 hours from Westfield. She settled into the seat, looked at the road ahead, and let Fort Harlan become what it would become in the rearview mirror, smaller and then smaller still, and then only the memory of a place that would not be the same place when the formal review concluded. Which it would not be. Which she had made certain of in 6 weeks with an encrypted drive in a digital recorder in the patient, methodical attention of a woman who had been taught by a man she loved that you do not fight early. You fight right. The pine line ran unbroken on both sides of the road. She watched it the way her father had taught her to watch terrain, not for what it was, but for what it might become when the conditions changed. The conditions were about to change at Westfield. She was 4 hours away, and she already knew 3 names, and the network ran ahead of her, and her father's letter was in her pocket, and the road was long and clear, and she was not going to waste a single mile of it. She looked forward and did not look back.